It is really great to see so many people come out today to speak, listen to our two guests here. A lot of familiar faces, which is always very nice. I don't get too many cans and tomatoes and rotten vegetables and stuff thrown my way, but I am very proud to be this community's library director. As Kristen has mentioned, I've been here just a little over 7 years. I've learned a lot from this community. I'm very proud to serve. But before we get started, I do want to thank Kristen and Grace Hyatt, our head of programs and communications, for putting this program together. So public libraries, the notion that they are a cultural crossroads for America, America's cultural crossroads, is very interesting, right? Because for generations, they've been known as book repositories. You know, we get our books, bestsellers, classics, newspapers, and for students, the dreaded microfilm, right? That was it. They were quiet places, places where you would go and the stereotypical librarian would shush you. But things have changed. And more now than ever, public libraries have been tailored to serve their communities in various aspects. And today, they are both a haven and a resource for many people, whether they're U.S. citizens, new Americans, refugees, people that have English as a second language. So we want to talk to Deborah and Chris about that. And we want to talk about the library's current landscape in our country and touch on some of the wonderful services that Chris and his team provide Chicago, and also the impactful work that Deborah has been doing as the director of OIF. So thank you so much. And really, as we go through the program, we will save about 10 to 15 minutes at the very end if there are any questions from those in the audience. But I want to start with Chris. Chris, thank you for coming. Talk a little bit about how CPL has been responding to the community. I had to process that there are 81 branches in the system. That's a lot. And to serve a community, the city that it is, can you talk a little about what some of the expanded services, some of the non-traditional services that CPL provides?
Yeah, and Tim, first, just thank you and Glencoe for hosting us in this beautiful, beautiful city or town. I think our libraries are all very similar in terms of like their undergirding principle. Like we are working with our communities, with our staff to figure out what are the needs and to find ways to respond to them. So in Chicago, our city has specific needs, and so what our services look like are a little bit different. Some of the ways that we've sought to evolve our spaces and our programs, you probably have seen our co-location libraries. So we were one of the first libraries in the nation to really kind of look at how we could utilize our library buildings to help revitalize corridors of the city. One of Chicago's big challenges is that we have had corridors and neighborhoods that really haven't seen investment for decades. And so we've been working with our department, the planning commissioner, our deputy mayor of economic development, really to think about how we utilize those libraries as part of a revitalization effort. So we've worked with the Chicago Housing Authority on some of these co-locations. So they're not just a library space, they're co-located with affordable housing. Some of our most recent 3 announced libraries, they have a performance arts center proposed to be in the space. They have an entrepreneurial incubator hub, a health center, spaces for community-based organizations. So we're really thinking about what are the challenges of Chicago, and for us a lot of that's reinvestment and revitalization of neighborhoods, and that's sort of our most recent solution.
And you've been with CPL for
2.5 years.
2.5 years. So maybe this is a bit of an unfair question, but when did you see those changes evolving, the needs of the community evolving, or have they always been there and it just took time for libraries to start responding to that?
You know, I wish it was sort of like a full-blown solution and just the first time we did a co-location that it answered those needs. But really, I think it was initially an effort by Mayor Rahm Emanuel to figure out how do we creatively solve the challenge of not having a library capital budget. So we have 81 libraries, but a lot of that budget is for deferred maintenance. It's not for new buildings. And so Mayor Rahm Emanuel put together this creative solution. We'll partner with Chicago Housing Authority, we'll use HUD funding, and that will allow us to update those spaces. So in the beginning was really simply, we'll take affordable housing and we'll co-locate libraries with it. But what it's evolved to now is more of a conversation with neighborhood community groups, with our city council, with our other department heads, to figure out what should be co-located with those libraries. And the most recent one is in Altgeld Gardens. It's on the far south side, pretty close to Indiana. There's not even a brick and mortar grocery store in that space. There's a lot of resource desert in that area. And so that library got co-located with a child care center. This idea that we can co-locate our libraries with spaces where we're going to actually be able to impact the lives of those visitors. So as those young kids are coming in, they're getting child care, they're also picking up their books. We're able to teach their parents about early literacy. We're able to better serve students. So it's an evolving model, like all of our work.
And that obviously that affects the profession as well. I mean, kind of bringing it back a little bit to the North Shore, there are neighboring libraries in our area that have staffed social workers, counselors, grief counselors, wellness counselors as well. So we're seeing that change, that evolution in the profession as well. Right. So has CPL, when Kristen mentioned that we had a Zoom call last week, and one of the things we talked about that is that at some libraries now, their staff are being trained in how to use Narcan for those that overdose. Is that something that is becoming more, is it more? Are we seeing more instances of that? Not only, and it's certainly not in just urban public libraries, but certainly in the suburban areas as well. Are we seeing that more throughout the nation?
I think, hands down, definitely. What we're working on doing is recognizing what issues and challenges our visitors come in with. So a lot of our work with our staff is making sure that people are able to provide trauma-informed service. So as we're working in neighborhoods that have seen just economic disparity and opportunity disparity, a lot of how those youth get impacted or what it means to live in poverty, people carry that with them. And so they're coming in our doors. We need to make sure that our staff are equipped and trained to recognize that. And if we're seeing an issue with someone who's experiencing homelessness issues or a mental health crisis, that the solution doesn't need to be, we're calling the Chicago Police Department. It could be that we're working with our public health department. They have a rapid response mental health team. And so really thinking about what challenges are people coming in with and how do we meet them, and that there are unique opportunities to make those engagements a chance to better their lives.
And Deborah, I mean, for those that are perhaps unfamiliar, Chicago, in the Chicagoland area, I mean, we're very fortunate. We have a wonderful system like the Chicago Public Library system. But we're also home to the American Library Association. So we're in a wonderful environment for maintaining that and supporting the idea and the notion of intellectual freedom. And Deborah, your office has been met with a lot of challenges recently, and we'll certainly touch on that more and go in depth in that a little bit more. But can you talk a little about the office and what you do?
Well, the Office for Freedom has been in existence since 1969, and our broad mission is to really uphold the ability of library users to make their own decisions about what they read, to provide access. and to make sure that libraries are able, through a series of statements, the Library Bill of Rights, the ALA Code of Ethics, to provide a certain level of service to library users that's centered on the user, their ability to make decisions, their ability to find the services and resources they need to improve their lives, to educate themselves, to enrich their lives. The library is a place to come together, to learn, to acquire skills, to, things as simple as early literacy and story time, support for homeschooling. And our office works with libraries to make sure policies are in place to enable that to happen. There are rules that go along with being a library. Most libraries are government-run, government-funded. They have to operate in conformity with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. That means the First Amendment comes into play, that they cannot engage in content censorship or viewpoint censorship when they make books available. They can't remove books in violation of the law. They also have 14th Amendment obligations to not discriminate, to make sure that there's equal and equitable services available for everyone, regardless of their identity, their background, their age, their beliefs as well. And so we've worked with our member leaders over the years to develop these guidelines, these statements for practice. They're called interpretations of the Library Bill of Rights. And so we actually have an interpretation on meeting rooms. When libraries make public space available, what are the guidelines to create a policy that makes sure that the library is not discriminating, they're not engaged in viewpoint discrimination, that they're providing equal and equitable access to the meeting room as a library service. And there's others as well that deal with censorship, the right of minors to have access to libraries, to ensure that the library is not discriminating on the basis of race, gender identity, sexual orientation, ethnicity, immigration status, and so that everyone can expect this level of service from libraries. So we do education. We provide direct support to libraries that are dealing with controversies and issues in their libraries. We engage in advocacy as well. So you'll see me from time to time talking about a book censorship issue in the community, for example.
So what is going on? What is going on in today's time where there are forces that wish to restrict access?
Well, we are seeing, I don't think it's a secret if you've been watching headlines, but there has been an organized effort by a number of groups to eliminate certain viewpoints from libraries, both school libraries and public libraries. And when I talk about school libraries, I talk about public school libraries that are government funded. It's their argument that materials dealing with gender identity, sexual orientation, that offer different perspectives on our history with race, racism, and slavery in the United States don't belong in particularly books intended for young people, but there are many groups that are extreme enough to argue that they have no place on any library shelf at all. So we are seeing these groups go to library boards, go to school boards, and demand the removal of these books. And they've had remarkable success, and they've even recruited elected officials in many communities, many states, to support the effort to suppress the voices of marginalized communities in libraries, when libraries have worked very hard to bring those voices in, to create a place and a space for everyone to feel like they belong in the community. And so we have done a lot of work recently to try to push back against this initiative. We're through the Freedom to Read Foundation, we have begun to litigate these issues. We have lawsuits filed in Texas and Arkansas to push back against efforts to remove books from libraries. The Texas lawsuit actually centers around a number of books that include Isabel Wilkerson's Caste. That was removed as being so harmful to the public good in that community in Texas that they felt they had to censor it, and we're fighting to get that book back on the shelf with citizens in that community who want to see the library return to what it was before, a place where you can find all kinds of ideas. But we're, glad we've gone from a time when we might, there's always been an effort to control what young people do, in any space, any place, but especially the library. And so we've always had censorship, maybe 300 reports of efforts to have books removed from libraries a year. Since 2019, we've gone from 300 or so demands to over 1,200 demands to censor books. And a remarkable statistic for me is that it used to be that a parent would see their student reading a book, have a concern about it, and they would go to the library and talk about that book. And that's what we would call a book challenge. And often it would result in the book remaining on the shelf. Now we're seeing groups go to the library boards with lists of 100 books at a time. 90% of the reported efforts to remove books from libraries in 2022 involved multiple titles, and 40% of them were demands to remove more than 100 books at a time. That's not a parent raising a concern about a book. That's organized political advocacy groups trying to censor particular ideas, to turn libraries really into centers of indoctrination rather than education.
And is there anything that library users can do to support that cause, to fight against restricted access and book bans?
Absolutely. I mean, libraries at their core, we know this more better than anyone, they're local institutions. They are run by, they're supported by the communities, the individuals who live in communities. So this is a local effort. So part of it is becoming aware and knowledgeable about what's going on at your local library board, at your local school board, and becoming engaged with that. I think we've fallen into a habit in the last few years of kind of saying, well, there's good people running those boards, but we've had some hard lessons in the last few years that that's not the case. So you have to be involved. There's also engaging in general advocacy to support the right to read, to support libraries as community institutions that are inclusive, that have a wide range of services that supply everyone's information needs. We actually do have a new initiative at ALA that is responding to some of this. It's called Unite Against Book Bans. It's at uniteagainstbookbans.org. And it's a toolkit for individuals who want to advocate for the freedom to read, who want to advocate for libraries, how they can get involved, how you might even think about running for school board or library board, and becoming one of those supporters that gets involved in the nitty-gritty of making sure that the library remains, through its policies, through its services, an institution that serves everyone in the community rather than narrowly focused on the needs or interests of one particular advocacy group.
And to go back to that, the statistic earlier that you shared, Deborah, it's been some time since I've had to do any reference library work, but I was able to pull this statistic. PEN America reported that in the first half of the 22-23 school year, there were 1,477 instances of individual book bans affecting 874 individual titles. That is a 28% increase when you compare it to the second semester of the 2021-22 year. So is this trend, is it gaining momentum, regardless of the good work that library professionals and library boards are doing? Is this continuing on? Is it building?
Absolutely. I mentioned that we provide individualized support for librarians dealing with book censorship or other intellectual freedom or privacy issues in their libraries. We used to get maybe 1 or 2 calls a week, and now we're getting 4 or 5 calls a day. I've had to increase my staff to respond to those calls. We rely on reports from librarians in the field for our data collection. And as I said, we went from 300 reports a year to 1,271 reports in 2022. And all of those were asking for assistance with book censorship in their libraries. And sometimes displays. It's not just books that are challenged. Again, libraries speak for a demand to remove or censor materials or service or resource. And so they're challenging pride displays. We had a number of instances here in Chicago where an advocacy group called Catholic Vote went in and deliberately checked out every book dealing with gender identity, sexual orientation that was out on display for Pride Month, so people could not see or read those books during Pride Month. That's an act of censorship. And how does the library cope with that? How does the library deal with that? And that's where we step in and talk to them about resources that can support replacing those books, developing policies and practices that prevent that kind of freelance censorship from happening. I mean, the sad thing for me for that is every library actually has policies in place that allow people to raise concerns about books and have that fairly addressed by the library administration. And by doing this, they're trying to get around that. They shouldn't have to deal with raising a concern about a book and going through due process. They get to make the decision for the community as a whole, and we really push back about that. We really defend the right of every reader to make their own choice about what they read, every family to make their own choice about what books their children read, and to make sure that there's a range of books. And that's our mission in supporting libraries doing this work.
And I think ALA has done this amazing job as well in giving us some context for who these attacks are coming from. So they had done a survey, was it 2020? A 2020 survey where they asked parents on both sides of the political spectrum to really answer, are you in favor of book censorship? And regardless of political party, over 70% of families said that they did not want to see their library collections or what their children were reading being censored. So I think that was a very important study because it helps us really understand that this is maybe a very visible issue, but it's not something that represents the majority of our country. This is a more of a...
It is very much a vocal minority trying to control our public institutions, our public spaces, and have those public spaces only reflect their beliefs, their ideals, their vision for what libraries should do. And I used the word indoctrination a little earlier, and I don't think it's too extreme to use that. They want to silence certain voices and erase certain ideas from the public discourse and kind of turn the clock back to another time when, frankly, I make analogies sometimes. There were segregated libraries in the South through the mid-60s, and I'm seeing a similar effort around LGBTQ rights in the ability of LGBTQ persons to find their books on the library shelf, to make use of library services, to have programming displays these days. And we're seeing policies, toxic policies introduced in communities in certain areas that are absolutely restricting access to books, access to meeting rooms, and access to libraries, and not in a way that's intended to benefit the community.
So Chris, what is CPL seeing? Because I think for the most part the headlines are kind of taken by what's happening in the outlying suburbs. Now's Main Public Library District for one, Downers Grove another, St. Charles another, yet another. The list goes on and on. But what is CPL? What is your team seeing?
We don't see the same level of attacks on the collection we have. So we don't really get requests to remove material. But what we are seeing more of is questions about what programs we have. So if we're doing programming where we bring in someone who, and this is a recent example, we had a presenter who identified as LGBTQ+. They were doing a fashion program. So teens could come in. This is someone who does work in the fashion industry. They have their own collections that they sell. And so they're a reputable presenter. They've worked with the Chicago Park Districts. We've been working with them for over 3 years. No issue of inappropriate behavior. And we had a group, I think the group is Gays Against Groomers, where they had done a bit of a social media blast, saying if you go forward with this program, you will hear from us. Which, of course, that sets up our presenter and our partner into a state of worry. The parents who are sending their teens to this program to really just learn about fashion and learn from someone who has a career in this area, they're now then worried. So I think we're not seeing our collections really being attacked. We're seeing more of our programs and the diversity of who's in our libraries being censored. And even though we didn't stop the program, we put out our own messaging, we worked with our own staff to make sure that they have their talking points. It is scary because a lot of the language is sort of this veiled threat of, or else.
Right.
And we do have a lot of, we have an issue around gun safety in America, and I think it just gets people worried and scared about, well, if we do this program, what is that going to mean?
So I was going to say, public libraries have never been a political entity. That was never by design, but certainly we've been pulled into that now. Most recently, even in our own state, the legislation against book bans in public libraries were passed. That to me is, and this is just my opinion, but it's both good and bad, because it's good because there is a fight there, but it's also bad because how did we get here? Why did we get here? And certainly that there are other elements to that conversation, but are public libraries being drawn into the political landscape much more than perhaps professionals, administrators, the ALA officers?
Yeah, I don't think people are actually reading these books that they're attacking, right? I think it's more of a symbolic issue. It's more of this political stance, and people are able to play this political game, and we're able to be used as this, this piece in that that political chessboard.
Right.
And I think what's tough too is I think we're very fortunate. We have Governor Pritzker and Secretary of State Gene Julius who said we're going to put forward legislation that is going to say if you're actively banning books, you may be in jeopardy of losing some of your state funding for your library. And I think it's also a political move. And my worry is that there are some libraries, and there are definitely some states where their response is, that's great, go ahead and take the funding away. We've seen this in Missouri with their Secretary of State. So I think it's the right move to say that you can't just remove books. There's going to be some ramification, but I think it is scary to think about, well, there may be library boards, there may be some libraries where that threat of that funding isn't a threat to them. And they may say, that's okay, remove that library funding, and then what is the state of those libraries? What's the state of those staff and their work and their effort?
And I will tell you that the threat in Missouri was truly frightening. We do work with the Missouri Library Association and Missouri librarians on that. And what we found out is that for many rural libraries, many rural communities in Missouri, the state grant is the only funding for library. If the state grant goes away, the library goes away. And that means all these small communities, all these rural libraries where the only ability to get on the internet, to make use of government services, to get books, would just go away because there was an objection to some 10 or 15 books in a particular library, or an elected official was taking seriously the idea that books dealing with gender identity and sexual orientation shouldn't be on the library shelf, even though no one's required to read those books. And that's truly frightening. I really do agree that tying into funding is an issue, but and I'll just be a little pedantic here and draw on my lawyerly training. We already have a law against censorship, and it's called the First Amendment. No government entity should ever be in the business, even when it's in the business of supplying access to ideas, but telling people what to read, what ideas to consider, what ideas are orthodox or unorthodox. And that is what the Library Bill of Rights is built around and what our work is built around. And the fact that we have a political environment right now where it seems to be fashionable to ignore that imperative, to really treat that very fundamental freedom and liberty in a very bad way, it just frightens me sometimes. So.
Right. And ALA's annual conference just wrapped up a couple of weeks ago here in Chicago, and the feedback from the Glencoe Library staff that attended, a lot of the focus was on this, training, kind of building momentum to kind of gear up and further the fight. Can you both talk about what sort of trainings are made available, what CPL provides, what ALA provides for library professionals?
We regularly provide professional development opportunities for library professionals and library workers, library trustees as well. I regularly do workshops on libraries and the First Amendment, and libraries and privacy law, which is my special area of expertise. Our office does trainings that help and equip librarians to deal with demands to remove books from libraries, what process to follow, what policies to have on the books, and how to navigate that very difficult conversation. And then one of the things I do is, and it was mentioned, you mentioned it in my biography, but we do training for county attorneys, city attorneys who represent library boards and school boards as well. And there are other parts of ALA that do different kinds of training. We have divisions for school librarians, public librarians, academic librarians that focus on their specialty as well. So we do a complete range of education on specific topics that are intended to equip library professionals with all the skills they need to address intellectual freedom issues.
And Chris, the system has a large staff. How do you maintain a knowledge consistency across the board with them?
I think to Deborah's point, when you go through library school, this is sort of ingrained in your education, and then our libraries have our collection development policies. So we really treat these as a disturbance of our library work and space, right? So people can't come in and start, taking books away or taking down displays. So we treat it as simply part of our standards of behavior, what we expect people to do when they're in our spaces. We did put out our book sanctuary campaign, so we wanted to give our staff some language and some steps they could take for how they do this work in their branches. So they have their kind of like statement about intellectual freedom. They have sort of their guides on what others can do, so they can make their own displays easier. But it's more, we've seen it more about equipping them with graphics and talking points and copy so that they can respond appropriately.
And Deborah, I've also learned that the Office of Intellectual Freedom actually assisted the Haskell Free Library, the subject of a state society. Can you talk a little bit about what your office did to support that?
Certainly. That's kind of an illustration because for all that we fight for libraries as spaces that provide for many needs, there comes a point when the library has to make a decision about what services it is providing to the community when its services are disrupted, and Haskell was an example of that. The Office for Intellectual Freedom got a call from the library director in Haskell in 2019, and he was just at his wit's end. I'll read you the report that he filed with our office that dates back to, and he says, the number of family reunions in the summer of 2018 was overwhelming for the library staff. And I guess we should, for those who might not have seen the play, understand that the Haskell Free Library and Opera House actually straddles the Canadian and U.S. border, two communities, Staniston, Quebec, and Derby-Line, Vermont. And it was actually founded that way deliberately by a wealthy woman in 1905 with the intent of providing a place for both communities to come together around the border. And for decades, said that there was no issue, people would pass freely, but with the attacks on the World Trade Center, with issues around immigration and things like that, the border has understandably tightened there, and it's raised issues for this library where the border literally goes through the front hallway in the children's department. You can straddle the Canadian-U.S. border in the children's department of this library. And after the travel ban came in 2017, people began going to this library. People who could not travel to the United States but wanted to see their families would go to the Haskell Free Library, and they would enter on the Canadian side, and their families who were in the United States would come from the U.S. side, and they would meet in the library. They would have family reunions in the library. Those of you who've seen the play can certainly understand that's the background there. But this became a matter for, newspapers and news stations did this. Sunday Morning famously did an extended story about this, and it became overwhelming for the library. And so Joel wrote me, Joel Kerr was the library director at the time, and he said the number of family reunions in the summer of 2018 was overwhelming for the library staff. There were simply too many people to keep track of, especially when watching out for the exchange of gifts, which must go through customs. The library staff, many of whom are volunteers, are not trained to be border security agents and have no desire to take on that role. The reunions were disruptive in general. Often people were using the library as if it were a convention center, having weddings, and in one instance, attempting to consummate the wedding in the bathroom of the library. They were ordering catering and food. The attention from the media and the subsequent attention from the tourists was also disruptive, perhaps even more disruptive than the actual reunions. And to aggravate the matter was the involvement of border agencies, agents both from the U.S. Border Patrol and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police would enter the library, sometimes acting aggressively toward patrons and staff, questioning patrons, asking them for ID. And this is where we were asked to help. What could the library do? And so we went through a process, and ultimately what we, I'm a little bit of a small c conservative on this. I believe libraries should serve the communities that support them financially, that support them by using their services, that live in the community with them. And that libraries are entitled to have reasonable policies in place to make sure that the library is still a space for that community. And so we started talking through policies for the meeting room space, for behavior in the library that was intended to preserve the library as an institution to provide books, internet access, resource to local services for the community that was there, and not become this tourist destination, this reunion space. And ultimately, they made the decision, the Board of Trustees for the Haskell Free Library made the hard decision to close the library to family reunions. They no longer allow individuals to come in and use the library as a space to make reunions. Part of that was pressure from the two law enforcement agencies involved, but also it was a desire to return the library. They actually could document a decline in circulation, a decline in the use of the actual library services because of the disruption brought to the library by its use by folks who, with best intentions in the world, they wanted to see their families and everything. And so ultimately they developed new policies in place. For example, you can't take pictures of individuals inside the Haskell Free Library anymore. They now have a new policy for that. They now have strict behavior policies about not being able to bring food into the library. Bags can't come in the library anymore, so that there's no issues with Customs and Border Patrol or the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I'm actually told the RCMP is actually more strict than the U.S. Border Patrol in this area. And so it's just an illustration of how sometimes with the best of intentions, libraries try to be a special space for individuals, try to provide for the needs of individuals, but as it becomes a situation where they lose their purpose for the local community as well. And so they put in place these policies.
So, are libraries the last public space in America? Are we to make that effort to maintain that, if that is the actuality, or are we looking at something else? Has the landscape changed so much for libraries that we're more than that, that evolves as time goes on, depending on what else is going on in the country?
I think libraries are, I don't know if they're the last public space, but they're certainly a public space and they're a public good. And the way we constructed libraries, that they're local community hubs and should be serving those community hubs with, and I think of what libraries meant for me. I grew up in a single parent family. come and find what they need to live their best lives, to educate themselves, to learn, to enrich their lives. Because what is life, I mean, fiction books we read to enrich our lives, the DVDs we borrow, or the streaming services we can now subscribe to through our libraries as the technology evolves. All that's so important for us as individuals, and I think it's a huge role that the library plays in our lives. It's, I call libraries little engines of democracy, where we can get the information we need to become, involved, civically engaged with our neighbors, our friends, to become involved in the political process with a level of knowledge about what we believe and think about. And, it's a miracle that, Ben Franklin founded the first library, but that idea that the government had a role in providing these resources so that the democracy had support for it, that everyone can be effective actors in the democracy or find what they need to become effective actors in democracy. And I think that we need to make sure we preserve libraries as that. Obviously I've worked for ALA for over 2 decades. I believe in libraries in a very big way, but I think it would be sad if we would allow political forces to turn the library into something different.
Yeah, I would hope that we're not the last public space, but when you do look around, there are not a lot of spaces that are publicly available that aren't, a company or a service being provided. There's just not a lot of spaces that are for everyone, regardless of your political affiliation. And so I do think we probably are one of those last spaces where we're meant to be inclusive of all kinds of perspectives.